the sawing of Saint Isaiah. Saint Isaiah appears in early Jewish and Christian writings. This ancient text describes how the prophet Isaiah was executed during the reign of King Manasseh of Judah, who ruled in the 7th century BC. According to the story, Manasseh had turned away from the worship of God and encouraged idol worship in Jerusalem. Isaiah, who spoke against these practices, became a target for persecution. In the account, Isaiah is said to have been captured, placed inside the hollow of a tree, or tied within a wooden trunk and then sawed in two. The description of his death is graphic and symbolic. It portrays the prophet as suffering for his faith and for refusing to compromise his message, even under extreme pressure from the king. One of the most horrifying punishments recorded in ancient history is scaphism, also called the boats. King Artaxerxes II of Persia once ordered this form of execution for a man known as Mithridates. Mithridates had accidentally killed the king's brother during a rebellion, and though he initially received praise for it, he later bragged too openly about the act. Offended by his arrogance, Artaxerxes ordered him to die. In scaphism, the condemned person was placed between two hollowed-out wooden boats or tree trunks with only the head, hands, and feet exposed. The executioners then force-fed the victim large amounts of milk and honey until they became sick and could no longer resist. After that, more honey was smeared on the exposed parts of the body to attract insects. The boats were left floating in a stagnant ponder swamp, where flies, worms, and other insects slowly consumed the victim's flesh over many days. Death came through dehydration, infection, and sheer agony. King Ashur-nasir-pal II, who ruled the Assyrian Empire from around 883 to 859 BC, was known for both his impressive conquests and his terrifying methods of enforcing order. His empire covered much of Mesopotamia, and his capital, Nimrod, became a center of power, art, and architecture. Yet it was also a place associated with fear, as Assyrian rulers frequently used extreme punishments to display authority. Among Ashur-nasir-pal's favorite punishment was flaying, the act of removing the skin of a living person. He wrote that he flayed many of the rebels, sometimes hanging their skins on city walls as a warning to others. These words were not hidden, but proudly displayed on monuments. The practice served as psychological warfare, spreading fear across regions that might resist Assyrian domination. One of the most terrifying methods of torture is brazen bull. Perillos was an Athenian craftsman who designed a new method of execution that he believed would please tyrants. He presented his creation to Phalaris, the ruler of Acragas in Sicily, sometime around the 6th century BC. Perillos's invention was a hollow bronze statue shaped like a bowl. Inside the statue was enough space to fit a person. Once the condemned was locked inside, a fire would be lit beneath it, heating the metal until it glowed hot red. The person inside would be slowly roasted to death, their screams echoing through a system of pipes that were designed to distort the sound into something that resembled the bellowing of an actual bull. The story goes that Phalaris ordered Perillos himself to be the first test subject. After demonstrating how the mechanism worked, the tyrant reportedly locked him inside to see if the device performed as promised. When the screams began to fill the air, Phalaris was said to have been so impressed and disgusted at once that he removed Perillos before death, only to have him executed afterward. In 71 BC, after nearly 2 years of bloody rebellion, Rome finally crushed the slave uprising led by the gladiator Spartacus. When Spartacus fell in battle, the Roman general Marcus Crassus decided to make an unforgettable statement. 6,000 captured rebels were crucified along the Appian Way, the main road that connected Rome to southern Italy. Crucifixion was typically reserved for slaves, pirates, and the lowest criminals. The victims' arms were tied or nailed to a wooden cross, and death could take hours or even days. The pain was not only physical, but also deeply psychological, since crucifixion was performed in public places to strip the condemned of dignity. The crucifixion stretched for miles, turning the road into a corridor of suffering. For days, travelers passing by would see the bodies of Spartacus's men hanging in agony as a warning to anyone who dared to rise against Rome again. Emperor Nero, who ruled Rome from 54 to 68, was a cruel, paranoid, and tyrannical leader who often ordered executions of perceived rivals, including his own mother and wife. Among the many disturbing accounts tied to Nero's cruelty is his use of rat torture. The technique involved trapping a rat in a metal container placed against a victim's bare body, then heating the container's exterior. As the temperature rose, the panicked rat, desperate to escape, would burrow into the victim's flesh, causing unimaginable agony. Because of his chaotic, corrupt, and unstable governance, he was eventually overthrown during a rebellion. Nero fled Rome and took his own life in 68, leaving behind a legacy full of madness and pure evil. Flaying of Saint Bartholomew, one of the 12 apostles of Jesus, is remembered not only for his missionary work, but also for one of the most horrifying martyrdom stories in Christian history. According to most accounts, Bartholomew traveled to regions such as India, Mesopotamia, and Armenia to spread Christianity. In Armenia, his teachings and reported miracles converted many people, including the king's brother. This angered local religious leaders who saw his influence as a threat to their authority and beliefs. They ordered his arrest and decided to make an example of him through torture. He was reportedly flayed alive, meaning his skin was stripped from his body while he was still conscious. During this unbearable pain, he was either crucified or beheaded, depending on the version of the legend. His suffering made him a symbol of faith and courage. Over time, Christian art began to represent him holding his own skin or a knife, which became his identifying attribute. Simon the Zealot was believed to have been a part of a Jewish resistance group, but after the supposed resurrection of Jesus Christ, he reportedly became a follower of Christianity. Carried the Christian message to distant lands, including Persia and possibly Armenia, where his preaching drew both converts and hostility. Simon was reportedly captured by local authorities who wanted to stop his growing influence. Refusing to renounce his faith, he was condemned to death by being sawn in half. Some accounts say he was cut vertically from head to foot, while others claimed the executioner saw him horizontally through the middle of his body. The image of being split apart was meant to show both physical agony and complete separation from worldly life. Saint Erasmus of Formia, often known as Saint Elmo, was an early Christian bishop who lived in southern Italy during the Roman persecutions under Emperor Diocletian. Despite threats and repeated arrest, he refused to abandon his faith or stop preaching. Erasmus was subjected to various tortures before his death. he was first beaten with leaded whips and imprisoned in darkness. Later, he was coated with boiling oil, resin, sulfur, and lead. Next, his torturers mixed molten metals and forced him to swallow them. Before his final torture, he was dragged through the streets while tied to a horse's tail. After continuing to stay faithful, his torturers cut open his abdomen and slowly wound his intestines around a windlass, which ultimately killed him. Guy Fawkes is remembered for his role in the 1605 gunpowder plot. This was a failed plan by a group of English Catholics who wanted to assassinate King James I and blow up the House of Lords to end Protestant rule. After his capture, Guy Fawkes was tortured on the orders of King James. Records show that he was stretched on the rack in the Tower of London until he confessed the details of the plot. The English government wanted to make an example of the conspirators, and so they were sentenced to the most severe punishment for treason at the time, to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. This punishment was designed to humiliate and cause maximum pain while serving as a public warning to anyone who dared to betray the crown. The execution was carried out in stages. First, the condemned man was tied to a wooden panel and dragged through the streets by a horse from the prison to the place of execution. This part of the process, called drawing, symbolized being pulled away from society. At the gallows, the prisoner was hanged by the neck until he was nearly dead, but not completely. He was then cut down, his abdomen slid open, and his internal organs removed and burned before his eyes. His head was then cut off, and his body divided into 4 parts. Each piece was displayed in different parts of England as a warning against treason. On January 31, 1606, Guy Fawkes and his fellow conspirators were executed in this manner. However, Fawkes avoided much of the suffering by jumping from the gallows and breaking his neck, dying instantly. Despite this, his body was still mutilated and distributed as the law required. François Ravaillac was a Frenchman who assassinated King Henry IV of France in 1610. On May 14th of that year, as the king's carriage was passing through the streets of Paris, Ravaillac approached and stabbed him to death. Ravaillac was captured immediately and imprisoned. He claimed that he acted alone and that his motive came from religious conviction, believing the king was betraying the Catholic faith. However, authorities suspected a wider conspiracy and tortured Ravi to extract information. Even after enduring severe pain, he maintained that no one else had helped him. When found guilty, he was sentenced to be drawn and quartered by horses, the traditional French punishment for regicide, on May 27, 1610. A massive crowd gathered to watch in Paris. Before the final execution, Ravaillac was subjected to additional public torture. His flesh was torn with pincers. Boiling oil and molten lead were poured onto his wounds. And then his limbs were tied to 4 horses. The horses were driven in 4 different directions, each pulling on a rope tied to an arm or a leg. At first, the horses were unable to tear his body apart, so executioners used knives to help sever the joints. The horrifying spectacle lasted for nearly an hour. Finally, when his body was dismembered, the remains were burned and the ashes were scattered to prevent any relics or memorials from being kept. Robert François Damiès was a French domestic servant who became infamous for his attempt to assassinate King Louis XV of France. On January 5, 1757, Damiens approached the king in the courtyard of the Palace of Versailles and stabbed him in the chest with a small knife. The wound was not fatal, but it caused national panic. Damien was arrested immediately, and during interrogation he was tortured to extract information about possible accomplices. His flesh was burned with hot irons, and molten substances were poured on his wounds. Despite the agony, he maintained that he acted alone, claiming his goal was to draw attention to corruption within the clergy rather than to kill the king. The court found him guilty of high treason. On March 28, 1757, in front of a large crowd in Paris, Damiens was taken to a wooden scaffold for his punishment. He was first tortured with red-hot pincers, and his hand, the one that held the knife, was burned with sulfur. Afterward, molten lead, oil, and wax were poured into his wounds. Then came the final act. Following the initial tortures, his hands and feet were cut off. Each amputation was carried out methodically, often requiring repeated blows due to the resistance of flesh and bone. Ultimately, his body was divided into 4 parts, all of which were burned in separate fires. Damien's execution was intended to be as slow and painful as possible, emphasizing the gravity of attempting to harm the king. It reportedly took him over 2 hours for him to die completely. Fan Jihai Ling Qi was a Chinese man whose death became one of the last and most infamous cases of Ling Qi in recorded history. He was convicted of killing his master, a crime that under imperial law was considered one of the gravest offenses. On the day of his execution, Fan was subjected to lingqi in Beijing. The condemned man was bound to a wooden frame as the executioners systematically sliced away portions of flesh over an extended period before ultimately killing him. Historical records and photographs taken by a French officer circulated in the West, which shocked many people around the world. With that being said, this style of execution was long rare by this time in China, and it's the last reported case of it happening. Unit 731 was a covert biological and chemical warfare research division of the Imperial Japanese Army during World War II. It was founded in the late 1930s and operated mainly in Harbin, a city and occupied Manchuria, under the command of General Shiro Ishii. What appeared to be a medical research facility was in truth one of the most horrifying sites of human experimentation in history. The unit's goal was to develop biological weapons and to understand how diseases could be used as tools of war. Prisoners referred to as logs by the scientist included Chinese civilians, prisoners of war, Koreans, Russians, and sometimes Western captives. The experiments were carried out without anesthesia or ethical consideration. Victims were infected with deadly diseases like anthrax, plague, cholera, and typhoid. Many were vivisected alive so that researchers could observe how the infection spread inside the body. Others were exposed to extreme cold to study frostbite, had limbs frozen and amputated, or were injected with various toxins to test their effects. Unit 731 also conducted field tests to see how effective biological weapons could be. In some cases, planes dropped bombs containing plague-infected fleas over villages, causing outbreaks that killed tens of thousands of people. Prisoners were also used to test weapons such as flamethrowers, grenades, and chemical gases. It is believed the experiment resulted in the deaths of several thousand people directly, while far more died from resulting epidemics. This prison, known by its code name S-21, was one of the most notorious torture centers of the Khmer Rouge regime in Cambodia. Operating between 1975 and 1979, it was a converted high school where thousands of people were imprisoned, interrogated, and killed under the orders of Pol Pot's brutal government.
The Khmer Rouge sought to eliminate anyone suspected of being an enemy of the revolution, and S-21 became a key instrument of this terror.
Those brought to Slang were accused of crimes against the regime, often without evidence. The prisoners included government officials, intellectuals, soldiers, teachers, and even members of the Khmer Rouge who were accused of betrayal. Once inside, they were photographed, documented, and shackled in small cells. Interrogations soon followed, designed to extract confessions of sabotage or espionage. Torture methods included beatings, electrocution, waterboarding, and starvation. Some victims were forced to name friends and relatives, who were then also arrested and brought to the prison. The goal of these interrogations was not truth, but total control. Prisoners were made to confess to imaginary crimes before being sent to execution fields. Tuol Sling had an estimated 14,000 detainees, and only about a dozen survived.